So to put it in perspective, where we live, I live up in northern Minnesota, way north Minnesota. We still have about 3 foot of snowpack in our woods. So our daily routine is we're on snowshoes. So when we're talking about seasons, you got to put in perspective. You guys are kind of, I've heard, done with your spring burn season, right? Our spring is simply there in the sense that we have migrants coming in and the rivers are starting to open up, but there's still ice on the lakes. So you got to kind of put that in mind. All right, so opening the burn window or using fire in different seasons or growing season burning, it all kind of wraps together. So what I want to talk about is kind of through well over 30 years of doing this, thinking about kind of a paradigm shift, moving from what I was taught is here's our burn window, here's our traditional burn window, into thinking about burning in other seasons. And so thinking like a fire-dependent ecosystem. And kind of one of the aha moments started when I worked as a seasonal with Forest Service on the Squamish Nicolet, out of the Nicolet side. And it was, we had a wildfire in July. It wasn't much, it was flames in inches, but it was spreading. And it was easy to put out. And about 2 days after that, we were on a site visit with different agencies, and I was just invited along as a seasonal, so I kept my mouth shut. But the fire management officer was asked a question about, you know, why aren't we burning now? And he said, it won't burn well, and it doesn't do any good. And I didn't bring it up in front of the group, again, because it was pretty shy. Got in the truck driving back, and I finally had the courage to ask him. He says, well, that fire was nothing. That wasn't doing anything. It didn't make sense to me because it was burning. It didn't matter that the flames were in inches, flame length were in inches, it was still burning and spreading. So I actually kept an eye on that private property while I worked there and got to see some of the different responses, including quite a few of the rare plants that popped up. So it was like an aha moment going, you know, this isn't matching with what I hear about fire-dependent systems. So that was kind of the long time ago shift. That was in the mid-1980s when that happened. It was already mentioned, but again, you know, who's this guy if you're talking about this kind of stuff? And, you know, it's kind of this arc of experience of, you know, a lot of prescribed burning, a lot of wildfire. Talked about seasonal positions, a long time stint, land steward and fire manager in Michigan, and an acting fire manager for Wisconsin. Program manager now. I also done some consulting contracting. I've done a lot of instructing or served as cadre in a lot of fire courses. So, you know, this kind of all builds to that too and kind of carried that through. All right, so what we do when we're doing fire, right? We have the how and the why. The how, as we all know, is, you know, how do we keep fire in the box? How are we implementing it? Covers our capacity, crew, you know, funding, equipment, burn plans. You guys know all this, land ownership, so on. But we don't often address, or we, at least when I started, weren't really addressing burn windows in it. You know, the prescriptions were to one type of the season, one time of the season. Then we get into why we're burning. And this is, I like using this one because, again, and I've had plenty of lessons learned experience where if you're not burning the way it should burn, well, then everything there is just as equally screwed, right? So it's like, how do we avoid making those mistakes or maybe correcting those? And, you know, when we talk about why we're burning, that's when we get in, you know, what are the fire effects, whether they're on native species, invasive species, or we're looking at vegetative diversity. You know, even if we're doing fuel reduction, just saying fuel reduction, I mean, that's still a fire effect. You know, are we looking at frequency, intensity, severity, seasonality is starting to come up more and more. You know, are we looking at ecological resilience? It's not just fire either. We all know that. How do we combine all our other techniques together? So we can look at fire as an ecological process, but then how are we wrapping that in as one of the tools, too, that we have in our toolbox? Because I did a lot of different weed work and everything else, too. So we talk about, you know, with suppression, we talk about firefighters. And then we talk about prescribed burns, our fire practitioners. And I really like to emphasize, we're not fire practitioners per se, right? Why are you burning, no matter when you're burning? You're trying to get fire effects of some sort. So we're kind of really fire effects practitioners. And I think sorry, I think this comic, Kelvin and Hobbes comic, which you notice I use it in different comics a lot, really illustrates it. your perception of fire is probably different than mine, is probably different than the person sitting next to you, and we all try to come to some common ground to figure out when we say fire or wildland fire or prescribed fire, what do we mean, right? What are all the nuances? And so I go back again to this. I mean, our arc here is, on one end we have our kind of goals, objectives, values, vision, whatever you want to call it. On the other end we have the fire effects. And in between, that's where we get into the how, right? What are our prescriptions? What are our weather? How are we implementing this? And often there's a disconnect between the prescriptions, the weather, and the implementation to meet the objectives, which meeting the objectives means we're getting the fire effects. And how many times do we go back and look at the fire effects and adjust our objectives, or adjust our objectives to meet the fire effects? So it's kind of looking at it that way. And I like to think of it as, you know, the bullseye there is the goals, or all the multiple objectives, or the vision, kind of that trend through time that you're trying to achieve. And all those arrows are individual objectives. So recognizing you can only achieve so many objectives with each and every burn, or with a mechanical treatment, or herbicide treatment, or so on. And so what do, right? I mean, everybody does this. It's adaptive management, trial and error. We keep flinging arrows. Ideally, we're tightening those up. We're learning so that we're more and more often hitting the bullseye. And so I put this in every talk. What it comes down to is, it's not the flames, but what they're doing. That's the goal. Okay, everybody likes to see fire, at least they assume everybody in this room likes to see fire, and we're mesmerized by the flames and all that. But what we're ultimately talking about is our fire doing what we want it to do? And the repeated burns, are they doing what we want it to do? Because if this is one of your goals, and I apologize, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but I've worked with different agencies, different state agencies, and unfortunately they get kind of railroaded into the acres game. Goal is the most acres possible. And that can be one type of objective, but if those acres actually don't achieve the fire effects, then they're useless. So what I always say is, well, then take all the money you would spend to do all your burns this year, put it in a garbage can, a metal garbage can, let's be safe. Start on fire, right? You get your smoke, you get your flames, you get your ash, you burn, whoop. You get the ash. If you spread that over all the acres you want, you've done the exact same thing. You've spent your money, you've got all your acres, you've had your little fire and smoke, but you've actually kept your crew a lot safer, either traveling to or from burns or being on a burn, and you've had your fire and so on, but you've achieved the same thing. Have you achieved any fire effects with that? No. So that's kind of that aha moment too, is thinking about this, that I know we want to increase acres, but think about, are those the correct acres at the right time? Are you getting anything out of increasing those acres? And this is not a designer burn mentality. This is trying to maximize. So think about opening. One way to get more acres is do more burning in one season, or expand out the seasons of burning to get more burns done. And so yeah, what fire effects are achieved? Are we looking at quantity versus quality as some type of measure of success? You know, if you say, well, we did a 20-acre burn, that's all we did, but it was really successful, versus we did 200-acre burns or 200-acre burn over there, and it really didn't do anything. You know, that's a mismatch. You got the acres, but maybe didn't achieve the goal. And ideally, as we increase acres, we want those acres to also be effective all the way through. So, you know, it's an outcome-based investment strategy, if you want to look at it that way, and it's kind of breaking away from traditional thinking, and always remembering we all should be a learning-based organization, okay, or learning-based individuals. All right, so what is growing season? And I emphasized again, you know, when I go back home, I'm going to put on snowshoes again. So my perception of spring is different. So you guys got to tell me what your spring is, what your winter is, what your fall is, what your early, mid, late growing season is. You can determine that by phenology and physiology. But in general, we know, you know, the wealth of the plants during our dormant season is in the roots, right? And then as we get into spring and growing season, then we have the above ground features. And it's not like everything grows and then everything's done, right? I mean, we have multitude of plants that Henry could tell us about that are sequencing through their life cycles at different times. So kind of what is your shoulder points? When do you think you're sort of into that early growing season? When are you leaving growing season and getting into fall, or whatever you want to call it? And the most susceptible plants are to any type of damage. That doesn't mean it kills them, but it can have a potential negative impact or positive impact, depending on fire adaptations, is when they're leafing out, when they're flowering, when they're producing berries or seeds of some sort. So there's a variety of different plants you can impact negatively and positively at any time of the year as you move through. The least susceptible is when they're in that dormant season, because again, most of their value is in the root systems or their annual growth. All right, so framing it around that. If you ask me, when should I burn in southern Illinois in the growing season, I'm going to ask you, when does your growing season start? What are you trying to achieve? Is it in mid-growing season, late growing season? It's kind of like asking me, or me asking you, hey, I want to drive to California. How much fuel is it going to take me to get there? I don't know. What are you driving? Where are you leaving from? What's your fuel efficiency? Are you driving a hybrid? Maybe you don't need gas. You know, something like that. So, all right, so what we're going to frame this is with the growing season stuff. A lot of my information is not based on one natural community. It's not based on a handful of burns. So it's based on burning in different pine systems, red pine and jack pine, forest and barrens. Quite a variety of oak systems, forest, woodland, barrens, but in oak systems. In prairies, mesic and dry sand prairie. And in prairie fence, sedge meadow, wet prairie, so wetlands. So it's across the range of a lot of natural communities, and you guys can lump or spread these out, but you can see this isn't just based on one system of burning, so it's kind of hard for me to give a case study based on one system. I'm trying to give you kind of the big overview picture. So I'm going to focus a lot in Michigan, because when I was with the Nature Conservancy in Michigan for almost 20 years, that was where we did a lot of experimental burning. I mean, we were burning in spring, but also throughout the growing season and in winter. And to point out, because I've been asked, well, you can get away with that burning up there in the northern areas because it's not that populated. We were burning in the cities. We did burns in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the middle of the city with highways around. So, you know, we certainly did have areas where we had a little more freedom and where we're talking true rural, but there's a lot down here too that was based in urban interface. So, you know, framing it that way. All the stuff I'm talking about is backed up not by, I mean, there's a lot of observational information, but the stuff that's really stressed in here is talked about different types of monitoring and research. So there's definite fire monitoring, looking at true fuel loading. We develop course level metrics for a lot of systems because, as we all know, monitoring can be expensive or labor intensive at least, and we developed a quick method to evaluate kind of scales where we are at, good, poor, good, fair, wherever we were moving it to. And then some kind of tangential fire stuff, and vegetation transects, photo monitoring, rare butterfly surveys. We have a number of different grad student projects that were teasing out actually if what we were seeing was really true, what's the correlation? So we have a variety of actual research linked with it too. And so I'm putting this up now so you can get a reference. Again, this is not based on a few burns. This is based on a lot of burns over a lot of years in a lot of different natural communities. And these all have the monitoring on it, different types of monitoring strategy. And you can see the acreage too, you know, small acreage up to large acreage, depending what it is. So it crosses the range. Why do you think March and October, I highlighted those? Not as much monitoring in the March ones, or at least not a lot of burns with monitoring. What's the backbone of some of your crews? Seasonal, right? University students, at least that was for us, and they're in school yet. So the burns we were able to get done were kind of cobbling together whatever crew we could to meet the capacity. Anybody want to guess October? Why not a lot? Anybody hunting here? Okay, and because I am an avid bow hunter, and because if I've been leading all these burns, I'm tired. I don't want to lead another damn burn. I want to go play, okay? If we haven't accomplished everything, and that's the reality of it. You know, it's like, I don't care how good the burn weather is today in the middle of October. I'm done. All right, more so is the repeated burns. All right, so this is not just based on a one first entry. It might be second, third, fourth, fifth entry. And obviously you can see it goes down because it's hard to burn a lot of times, even over 20 years or so, to evaluate that. But there is a lot of repeat burns in here. Oh, and I want to back up. Don't disregard, I mean, one of the sidebars, people say, oh, you know, you're saying switch to growing season burning. No, I'm not. I'm saying open the burn window and evaluate growing season burning. We did a lot of burns in the spring season and less in the fall, but we're moving into that. So this is not a growing season burn is better. It's not a comparison. It's just opening the burn window and evaluating different fire effects by different seasons. All right, so here's the paradigm that I started with. It was okay to burn in a certain window and not in another. And these were kind of the cutoff dates in Michigan. And a lot of it had to do with, anybody want to guess? Why was it a no burn scenario?
Wow.
Game species, nesting bird species, different rare species. Okay, it was just a burn or no burns in this scenario. You tell me what's wrong about okay to burn. You got half a year to burn, right? Woohoo! What's wrong with this time period for burning? Yeah, everybody here, snow. This is a red squirrel sitting on our deck too, for instance. Okay, so even if you don't get snow, you're still in dormant season. You might not have the effect, but if you're under snow, you're not burning that, right? So what you end up with, can you do winter burning? Anybody do winter burning? Yeah, some. You can do brush piles, phragmites, cattails, you know, kind of that biomass reduction. Sure, so you can capitalize some on that. But if we look at that no burn scenario and then our spring summer windows, by what I was looking at where I was working, we had roughly about 60 total days, okay? But then when you add those wildfire risk days or windy days or burn ban days coupled with rainy days, we went down to about 30 operational days. So this is the second thing that really pushed me into exploring burning at different times. Because this was incredibly frustrating because especially if we had a wetter year, we might do a couple burns and we were done. That was it. Okay, we just weren't having the burn days. So if we look at it from the dormant season fire effects with the rare species, or just kind of a suite of species, you know, you can increase your, and the green is positive and up, red is negative and down. It doesn't mean totally killing plants, it's just mean kind of shifting their dominance. So, you know, if you always burn in kind of that spring, you might shift dominance towards warm season, lose your cool season. You know, you're impacting negatively your early and mid-flowering forbs and enhancing the late-flowering forbs and the legumes. And it's pretty similar here, backed up by a lot of monitoring, pretty similar kind of in that fall season. And if we flip it to our invasives or competitives, actually calling out individual species, you basically, I always like to see you tick off those species that are there. They're going, woohoo, we're not necessarily adapted to fire, but we're adapted to disturbance, and we can maximize this. Now, this doesn't mean don't burn in the spring. If you're trying to meet an objective, you can meet in the spring, but it means if you have an invasive species that can capitalize on that, you better be prepared to do something else with that species, some type of mechanical herbicide, you name it. Be prepared, either before or after, and repeat it. Okay, so lumping a lot of the different surveys that we put together, you can see the reason people don't do burning in the growing season may have to do with rare species and permitting, or wildlife concerns in general. May have to do with we don't have the weather, we don't have prescriptions. We might have air quality problems or smoke problems. It could be a capacity issue. Hey, our staff are already doing something else. It could be social acceptance. We don't know what the public's going to think, or it's a high recreation area. And these are all real concerns, you know. And then there's the investment in time, labor, and money to kind of learn a new thing. And so, but you need to be prepared to do that if you've never done it. Take that time. I mean, that truly is an investment. But so if we lump it even farther, the two pull out is real or perceived growing season fire impediments is the lack of knowledge or available information on seasonal fire effects. There's just not a lot out there, at least in the peer-reviewed. It's more in the hands of the managers right now. And then we'll get to the unrealistic expectations here. So there's an example of growing season burn. A lot of people would say, not doing anything, shut it down. This actually can do a lot of good. Here's a different one, different example. Okay, you can see the flames, barely. See the smoke. That can do a lot of good too. And it's burning, it's going to continue. Does this maybe look like a spring burn? This is an oak white pine woodland. Does that look like a spring burn to you? So you can get into growing season, you can be in growing season, the growing season window, and your fire can be pretty close to your fire behavior in the spring, which can also surprise people if they're prepared for, oh, this is not going to do much. All right, so the important thing you think is the heat output. We talk a lot about fire intensity, so you know that's our energy release, flame front, residence time, so on, rate of spread. And then what we often forget about is the fire severity. You know, what's actually happening with that, because the intensity is kind of flash in the pan, for instance, but the severity is the different measure. Both of those together, plus or minus, is what is our indirect and direct effects, you know, that we're looking for. And so I always like to use, again, intensity might be taking your hand and putting it through the candle flame. I mean, that might be that flash, you know, if you do your hand fast, if you're not going to burn it, right? And severity might be related if you hold your hand over that candle flame, even high above. You're going to eventually feel that heat. So kind of equate it to that. The other thing, and I've helped review a lot of different burn plans, everything else, be careful how you write your plan. Too many times I see, we need a moderate intensity burn from a head fire. Why specify your ignition pattern? And also the question would be, are you sure you need to meet your objectives with is it the intensity that's doing it, or is it the severity? You could have a low intensity, low flame length burn, long residence time, really slow rate of spread, that could be a moderate severity, that could actually be the release factor or the thing that's doing what you want to do. So you can get a lot of different, you know, and anybody's doing a lot of burning, you guys know that. You can get a lot of different fire effects depending on your ignition patterns. So try not to lock yourself in to saying we need this type of ignition pattern, because then you're kind of tying your hands, unfortunately, too much. So keep the burn plans as general as possible. I'm sure the federal folks in here are going, yep, we don't need any more tying of our hands. All right, so we know that fire does good for a lot of different native species throughout the system. I mean, throughout the season, excuse me. And so if we kind of, you know, detail that out, then, you know, are we talking woody, coniferous and deciduous, or herbaceous, annuals or perennials, comparison of that? And where are we in that system? And then that live fuel moisture, wrapping that in, you know, and that can also obviously dictate kind of your fire behavior and your rate of ignition and your ignition and spread and residence time, because you're now throwing in a lot of live fuel moisture with that. Also keep in mind, you know, we're talking about the above ground, but don't forget soil. You know, it's our living component. That's what soil is. It's not dirt. It's soil, all the mycorrhizae, fungi, everything else. But we're also getting a general switch, right? Our soil moisture and duff moisture is much higher in the spring. And then as we go through the growing season, it dries out more and more typically. This is a generalization, right? So that means your fire severity can increase with any kind of fire, but especially if we're into later growing season, you can actually have a higher severity because it has to do with that soil moisture or duff moisture that we're dealing with too. So it's kind of thinking it through a 3D picture, that's kind of a 3D that's always moving. And so this is kind of burns here, and the dots are, if there isn't snow cover, you can move, you could burn even, have more burn opportunities. But you can also then start to use seasonality not only to open your burn window, but to actually dial it in. So it's not, again, a designer burn, but what it's doing is you can start to say, well, wait, with this objective, here's our primary objective for this burn, we can meet that better in July or August. Well, that takes that burn unit off for spring. So you can start to pare down or divvy up your burn units across an entire season of burning. And I can tell you, for some of these units where we went from restoration to maintenance phase, those are the funnest units because we just put them on and said, when we're in the area with the crew that we need, and we got nothing else we're going to do, we're going to go light those on fire. It was entirely random once we reached kind of a maintenance phase. And those are some of the best units. Yeah, but it took years to get there. So if you look at it from this perspective now, you can see the flip here like in the Forbes. And again, it's not like now you're wiping out. It's not like you're wiping out all your Forbes, but you're shifting the dominance. So if you've been favoring spring burns, which are favoring more of the late flowering Forbes and knocking the heck out of these, now you might be able to switch it to that. And if they're on the seed bank, you might have to seed them in. But you can see you start to shift across a whole window. This is where the diversity is right there. It's across all of that. And again, this is not to say if your spring burns and fall burns are doing everything you need it to do, wonderful. Then don't shift for that reason. If you look at it from the perspective of the non-natives, this is where you can start to use fire as one of the tools, because you can deal with a lot of the non-natives or competitive plants with the growing season burns and different part of that early, mid, late growing season. So that can be in effect, again, it's all about how you're using heat at a stage or physiology of the plant when it is the most susceptible to damage, put it that way. So obviously for the invasives and competitives, we want to use them. So combining like fire with other techniques, herbicide, chemical, herbicide or mechanical or other techniques, that can be a really good option. And consider alternative methods of fire. If you don't have the fuel on the ground, this is mostly solid knapweed in here. And we're like, well, we know we can take it out with repeated burning, but there's no fuel to burn because knapweed, once it gets to a certain density, doesn't burn. It's not fuel. So you're burning propane, it's clean, and lo and behold, we were able to take, basically mowing with fire. This is one of the first models we get. There's a much better example, but this is the funnest one. This was our crew recruitment, right? How many seasonal people would go, I want to ride that thing. But it was an alternative. But what the result was is it activated. Basically, we got a lot of native response, especially our perennials and annuals, by getting heat. And these things are a lot hotter than prescribed burn. I mean, those things are burning about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit at the tip. Now, again, you might be driving faster, but if you go really slow, you're taking the knapweed out. And we do this repeatedly in the same area in the same growing season. So the point is one pass might take out the young knapweed that don't have the rootstocks, but the repeated burns, basically we force them to resprout and force them to keep resprouting, and they don't have the root reserves to withstand constantly resprouting without actually storing energy. So we basically force them to resprout until they starve to death, essentially. It also caused a lot of the young knapweed, because we know that stuff can remain in the seed bank for quite a while. We caused that to germinate, and then the next pass killed all the stuff that germinated because there's no roots there. So again, it's using kind of that plant physiology against itself. All right, so here's one of the other crux we know, right? All the rare species or game species are nesting birds. How many people are restricted by animals? And again, I worked a lot with threatened and endangered species. Almost every burn was that. So I don't know if you can read up there. It says competing values, restoration of paralysis, because we will not accept actions that harm individual animals. Can you guys read the sign? Also, the bridge is out ahead. So seriously, if we look at this, and I'll argue this and we'll get to other slides, but if we're so focused and not thinking long term, you know, the whole bridge is out. I mean, you're losing everything, whether you're losing the rare species or maybe the common species are going more rare. And there's a mass saga. They don't walk around with fire extinguishers or fire shelters or anything, right? So a fire-dependent animal is one that lives in habitat that's fire-dependent, and the animal receives the benefits, right? Simple as that. Doesn't mean they necessarily will survive. Fire, you're not going to survive a fire if you stand in front of it, right? So, you know, we can't expect that. So how do we minimize impacts? Another argument here, it's not just fire. What are all the things that can kill those or injure them in any one day? So that's what we got to kind of get in perspective. There's a multitude, right? Mowing, timber harvest, vehicles, there's a lot of things that can kill those. Fire's up there, but predators. How about other biotic or abiotic disturbances? Fire's one of the abiotic disturbances, only one of them, right? Which other ones can kill? So any animal out there has threats. And what we can do is every time we put fire out there, try to figure out how do we minimize killing individuals, but at the same time recognizing if we're restoring a fire-dependent habitat, that's the bigger plus to that. So if we burn right, we get this wealth of diversity, wealth of flowering. There's Carner blue scattered in here. And if you can look, there's flames behind that lupin. It's a hose plant. So you can dial in also when to burn when the butterflies are least susceptible, as an example. But without fire, so here, put it this way, if you do fire at the wrong time or repeatedly wrong, or you're not connecting your fire effects correctly, that's why they're rare. So if we can get fire back in, but also meet those needs, kind of thinking about throughout a season potentially, you know, then we're going to reverse that cycle ideally. So they're rare, fire-dependent animals are rare because the lack of ignition for a long time and the change in habitat. All right, so move into expectations for growing season burns based only on past dormant season burn. How many people here have done any growing season burning or been on them? Okay. Can they be different than fall or spring or fall burns? Right, or they might look the same and you're surprised initially. So, here's what I often heard. I was called crazy when I started doing this decades ago. Ro probably remembers that, right? We were called crazy. You can't be burning in that. You cannot burn that in the summer. That's a July burn in a pretty much closed canopy oak white pine forest. It looks like it's burned pretty well to me. You know, so it's kind of using examples. So the traditional based thinking might be our traditional window is this. That's what I was taught. That's it. You know, we move on to doing something else. And now it is break that paradigm. Evaluate. Can you do it? You might not always be able to. We know there's certain habitats that just won't carry fire in summer because they don't have the right fuel combinations, basically. This is a prairie fen in July. This is one of the few pictures I have where you actually can see the flames shooting up. Half the time you're tracking it simply by where's the smoke, because it's burning down underneath. Not down into the organic, but they're in the surface. Somebody told me this once, and hopefully nobody says that today. We tried a summer burn and it did not work, so we're not going to try it again. All right, how many of you have every one of your spring and fall burns worked? Every single one, all the time, every one? Okay, so if we tried this once and it didn't work. What do you mean it didn't work? Why didn't it work? It probably didn't work because of you, not the fire. Okay? What do you need to do differently to get effects? And if you can go through a sequence and say, it's just not working here because we're not meeting objectives, well then that's a better, okay, now I get it. Now, but if you try something once and it doesn't work, you know, you get a problem. So shift to, you know, again, always keep that learning based. How do we learn from this? Half the time it's human errors or more, right? Okay, we'll never do a summer burn because it will be too smoky. Time and again heard this. feel free to talk with Trent Wickman. He's an air quality specialist with the Forest Service, or one of his counterparts. He works out at Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin. He was totally baffled when he heard this, because it's smoke modeling and smoke management. So I'll ask you this. Are you telling me your spring and fall burns don't have smoke? Or don't have smoke modeling, or aren't ever too smoky? So it's kind of recognizing that every time you put fire out there, you're going to have smoke, and it's how you model and manage. Now, if you go through modeling management and say, we can't do a summer burn here because of the smoke impacts, that's different than saying, it's going to be too smoky, we're not even going to attempt it, or we're not going to evaluate it. Just for reference, that's a dozer. That little dot, that's a dozer. This is a Jack Plain Barrens burn. So, and this is not in a rural area. This is an urban area. So you can manage your smoke with smoke modeling. It might tighten your prescription a lot, but it can be done. So, hopefully I've emphasized you can burn, because I got tens of thousands of pictures showing burns in every season and every habitat. So what we were able to get into is this: implementing burns in future burn unit prep, and do burns and equipment, trying to do it in the off season if we had an off season. And so we'll wrap it up with this. Some of it's saying, well, we don't have enough burn days in summer. Okay? It's maybe not recognizing it. So these are the numbers, 94 through 2012. So, and I don't remember why we did the breakouts there, some statistical thing. But in reality, there's 40 days in this time period, 36 in this, 77 there. 77 there and 30 there. And averaged out, we had 26 burn days, 25 burn days, 40 and 16. So almost half of any period we had burn days. So when somebody says, we don't have burn days in the summer, I said, well, I don't know what you were looking at. You're looking at wrong fire behavior, or looking at wrong prescription. So here's a quick breakdown here, just an example. 2011, this is when we felt we really had it dialed in. So we proposed 79 burn units across different seasons. We estimate 114 operational days, and if you notice, your spring season's the typical, you might be able to do 2 or 3 units in a day. As we move into growing season, the paradigm shift is those one unit might take you a number of days if you can let it burn out, or longer. Okay, so the paradigm shift is how you shift your implementation of the burn. Okay? The result with this was we actually did 78 burn units, so one less than estimated, and we did less days, less operational days. But again, it was right on with, we actually ended up with doing, that shift, more days, more patrol, consumptive mop-up, basically. And so yeah, that's a paradigm shift. It's hard to break that. We're going to go burn a couple of units and then be done because there's not a lot of mop-up, to we might have to do patrol or monitoring or something else for day after day if we're going to get the results. So I phrase it this way. So what's more effective? If you're meeting objectives in your spring burns, great. But if you're not, then you might have to say, well, gee, you're telling me we might need 6 days of budgeting for one burn in the summer, but then we don't burn it again for a while? Well, if you're meeting objectives, then that 6 days of burning in 1 year is cheaper than trying to do 6 consecutive years of spring burning in the wrong season to meet your objective. And just kind of wrapping it up, this is a Fen example. So 1995, pre-restoration, 2010, post-restoration. Actually, the photo is even earlier. This is the same photo point. That there is just barely seeing there. Oops. And it was not just fire. So it was inundated with buckthorn. There was a couple little patches left of prairie fen, tiny, quarter acre, third acre type patches, with 800 plus acres of buckthorn all around it. But it was a combination of herbicide and spot burning with the seedlings and other chemical treatments for other invasives, and burning of brush piles, and then finally basically having the fuel to do spring and growing season burns. We're dealing with eastern Massasauga and everything else, and there's grad student work on. So, it's a lot of investment time, but it really worked. The same with here, breaking up transition zones. This is all one burn from different angles. Some forested areas, some dry sand prairie, all different effects. Large burns, and you can see different burn or different fire behavior, different ignition techniques. And then we also did night burning when the conditions were still a little too hazardous, but we could burn at night. We prepared for that. And just kind of wrap it up with this. When we moved into doing jack pine stuff, I will not touch a jack pine. I won't leave it as a burn boss in the spring. Not unless we get a lot of capacity, because it's just too dangerous, because you're in the spring dip window, which is when the needle moisture is lowest. It's actually the carbohydrate structure of the needles when they're basically explosive. And if you move outside of that, you're also moving into live fuel moisture. So even if you get some torching and spotting, the rate of spread is so slow with these, you can catch them. So we moved, when we burned in those by season for risk aversion, and lo and behold, the fire effects were really good. So, you know, we lucked out there. But that wasn't, we didn't move for fire effects. We moved mainly to see if we could burn safely and get the fire effects. So that's the wrap up. Basically, when we started varying the way we did fires, varying the time, intensity, severity, and frequency, so seasonality's in there, and focusing on our long term, this is what we did. We started reducing our high fire deficit, increased our native plant diversity, increased the rare species animals and plants, decreased non-native and competitive, started achieving that shifting mosaic of habitat types and promoting the resiliency. I like Calvin and Hobbes. That's a great one with the question. We're ready for questions, if we have time.
Yeah.
Oh.
7 minutes.
So do you find that it works better on restorations or on remnant systems in terms of your effects, in terms of like achieving a goal? Is it completely different on like a restoration, or is it
Versus a remnant?
Yeah.
No, it's the same. I mean, it's kind of, the restoration is you're trying to almost be more aggressive with fire and other tools to get it to maintenance stage without losing individuals of rare species, you know, animals. Remnants is, you know, that's again a question of like, well, how big is it, and is there any connectivity, or is it an isolated remnant? That's going to dictate more what you're doing. You might not be able to have a lot of different seasons of burning because it's so small. How do you break it up into small units? I mean, I don't know if that helped, or if that's what you're looking for, or... Okay. Oh, no.
What kind of fire return intervals are you talking about for growing season burning in general, or what are some of the different objectives that you get from doing different return intervals?
That gets in the frequency. So, you know, if you're saying we want to do, you know, it's not like putting it on a calendar and say every 3 years you're going to do it. You might say, you know, we want to burn this unit frequently, but it's what's the next objective. That might dictate, yep, growing season burn will meet that, or no, it's a spring burn. So it's, the frequency is almost separate from the seasonality. So if you say our rough frequencies, we want to burn you every 5 years in some fashion, that could mean one burns a summer burn, one burns a spring burn, one burns a fall, and it all depends on the objective you're trying to meet. So it's not like taking and saying we're going to match seasonality to frequency, because that's kind of a mismatch with the fuel. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you had one too, and there's another one up here.
Yeah. Do you do burn severity monitoring? And if so, what protocol do you follow?
Oh boy, it's been a long time. I can't even remember the burn severity monitoring. We did, yes. There's a lot new models out there. God, I'm trying to think of the guy's name now out of the North Atlantic Fire Science, who's done a lot more with that. Ours were, you know, outdated at this point with the new techniques, but that's, you know, do that, definitely. Yeah, we monitored everything we could to determine. Yeah, there, I guess, I don't know. You've been waiting a while.
On your slide, the seasonal fire effects, non-native and competitive plants, I'm looking specifically at honeysuckles here. You've got that the population will increase in March, April, and October, November burns.
Yep.
Is that strictly in Minnesota? Because we don't find that in southern Illinois.
It's not in Minnesota, this was done in Michigan, but in all the burns we did, we couldn't generate the heat intensity to, you could top kill the honeysuckle and it came back, resprouted, it came back stronger than ever. So, but when we shifted to growing season, because of long residence time, we could actually totally kill that. Now your examples, you'd have to go and see how it varies here and why, are your different seasons of burning may be effective. Because this is based on, we dipped there. So I don't,
So a growing season burn actually kills it completely.
we could get total kill on some of this. And, even on big ones, because it's like a candle. It's the amount of heat per unit area for the length of time. We reach the lethal temperature to kill those plants, those individual plants. Or we stress them and harm them so much that something else could stress them and take them out. So in all the spring burning, that was not, we could top kill stuff and that was okay if we were going to come back and treat resprouts so on. But if we were also trying to use fire to take them out, then the growing season was the most effective. It had to do with that heat output and those, keeping that fire really slow, long residence time. So basically cooking all those stems and reaching that lethal temperature.
Just wanted you to touch briefly on, I think it was a point you made yesterday on the hike, about aggressive burning, seeing TEs come back, and then slowing burning down to accommodate, not killing snakes, etc., and then seeing those populations crash again. I believe you mentioned that. It was a point that really seemed to stick out.
The aggressive was part of the aggressive meaning pretty frequent burning, whether it's spring or summer. And this was in oak systems, and this was to get the leaf litter down, but not all at once. And we got oak regeneration. We switched from oak leaf litter depth to kind of our herbaceous community. But then the pause in that was to allow those oaks to get out of that sapling bottleneck. So it's recognizing that, hey, we got this looking well herbaceous, and we still have a lot of our dominant oaks and they're long-lived, but unless we get that next stage of oaks coming up, down the road, we're going to lose the whole system anyway. So the reference for the rare species was where that seasonal burning has been paused or stopped because it's been handed over to somebody else. Those rare species that have really expanded out or numbers increased are now going the opposite way. So it's a direct correlation with when the fire was changed or the frequency and seasonality was changed, we watched the species that are trying to be protected, their numbers are just dropping again. So I'm not managing those anymore. And Ro could, I don't want to point a finger at you, Ro, you weren't doing it, but he can talk about some of those preserves in detail too.